So good morning. I'm Ranade, and I'd like to welcome you all to New Perspectives, an integral yoga platform that is sponsored by our university in Surat, India, and the Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Surat and here in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. Today is our final webinar on the development of consciousness. To date, our guest speakers have presented on the ascension towards higher realms of consciousness with Matthias Cornelissen, then on the descension into the subconscious and inconscient realms with Dr. Sumitra Basu. And last week, Dr. Alok Pandey discussed going within to uncover the soul or psychic. So today we address movement of consciousness, the expansion or widening into universal planes. Sri Aurobindo speaks of the various stages that an egoistic consciousness passes through in its emotional expansion before reaching a true universal consciousness. Here he says, at first, the egoistic consciousness is bound within itself and therefore callous to the experience of others. Then a sympathetic attitude begins to develop towards other, and eventually from here, charity and altruism may become the driving motive. But one must go beyond even altruism, says Sri Aurobindo, to enter into the universal consciousness. Today, we are greatly honored to have with us Sraddhalu Ranade, who will speak on widening our consciousness. Welcome, Sraddhalu. It is, of course, always a pleasure and truly an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
Thank you. At this time, Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko here at the Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Fountain Inn, and our moderator for today's webinar will more formally introduce Sraddhalu and open our New Perspectives Forum. But before turning it over to Vladimir, I'd just like to remind all participants to please post your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And we have allotted time towards the end of the hour for Sraddhalu to address your questions.
Thank you, Radhe. Sraddhalu Ranade is a scientist, educator, and a scholar residing in Sri Aurobindo Ashram, and with his immersive workshops on integral education, he has influenced over 5,000 teachers throughout India. He has traveled worldwide in over 30 countries, delivering lectures and conducting workshops on education, management, self-development, and Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. We welcome Sraddhalu to shed some light on this profound topic of widening consciousness, why and how it is important for self-realization, and especially within the framework of integral yoga practice. Please, Sraddhalu.
Prior to this session, there has already been some discussion about deepening, heightening, as well as plunging in the lower ranges of consciousness. And initially, I will touch upon some ideas which would have already been discussed then, but bringing them now into the larger context of this widening movement of consciousness. In our human journey, our first or earliest memories is of an emergence from an extremely narrow focus of ourselves, a kind of extreme self-centeredness into which we are first born. The nature of that birth is experienced by the soul as a plunging through many layers of consciousness, denser and denser gradations, until it finally joins and fixes itself or binds itself into the physical body of the child. And the physical, biological base of the mind of the child, that is in the brain, is not yet fully formed at that point. And therefore, the entry into the physical body and identification with it is experienced like a tremendous, stunning blow to the consciousness. Everything is suddenly dulled, narrowed, darkened, made heavy, and there is a loss of memory, a loss of sense of ourselves, and often a complete loss in which you wake up as this body that is born. And so at first, our earliest memory in the physical body is this narrow, little, fragile, dependent center of the universe. Because as a baby, your first instinct is not to be looking out to build relationships outside, but it is to be looking out to take nourishment for yourself. The first instinct nature instills in us is one of growth of our individuality. Into that, there are other complex instincts, but the first drive is the growth of the individuality and the stability and perhaps a more completeness in the growth of the individuality. And so you feel hungry, you cry, you make a sound, and the food comes in. You hurt yourself, you cry, and someone comes and pacifies you and cares for you. And it's as if the whole universe is out there to serve you, which is a beautiful experience. But very quickly, as the individuality begins to grow, the universe also starts tapping on our windows and our doors, asking them to be opened, but not too early. There's a graded process in which the nature's instinct in us takes us to a complete and healthy individualization. If you observe the gradations of consciousness which unfold, even from a biological perspective, you see first the healthy development of the base of the physical body. Your muscles have to become strong enough, your bones have to become strong enough that you can hold your balance and stand and interact, and then the skills of your muscles, and then the fine motor skills, all these. And with it, the emotional opening also grows. But at first, you'll find the baby is fragile and cannot take an intense emotion. Someone comes who is very angry, the child starts crying. He cannot handle vibrations which are contrary to his sensitivity or too intense for his sensitivity. And yet, bit by bit, as the strengthening of their life energies takes place, subsequent to the body's strengthening, the capacity to deal with these also grows, and the child learns now to balance out responses, push back, absorb, hold, modify, throw, etc. And then the mental capacities which have been slowly preparing now come into their own, especially in teenage, as the primary drive. Then the completeness of the individual is attained to some degree which is stable enough, let's say at late teenage. And of course, it still continues later, but once it is sufficiently stable, the first correction nature makes to that instinct is to break the shell of this narrowness which was first produced. And there's a logic to it. Unless that individuality is sufficiently strong and stable, an opening of it to a greater possibility would be unstable, precarious, and the individuality might be easily lost. Think about it in this way. Your body is made of substance that's drawn from the universe. You eat. It's gathered, circulated within you, and thrown out. You draw life force, circulated within you, and thrown out. Even the mind thoughts come into you, sail into you, and you throw out. There's a continuous flow from the universe into your little narrow individuality and then thrown out from there. The underlying reality is this complete universality, always. The individuality is almost like a knot, like a little whirlpool in the ocean. And it's so easy for the whirlpool to lose itself, lapse into the whole ocean. If there was not a sufficient focus of nature to build this individuality and stabilize it in a very rigid material form, we would never be able to be effective agents of life and eventually for the spirit as individual focal points of the spiritual action. So there's a huge investment nature puts in strengthening and binding us into narrowness first, which then later we struggle against, but with good reason now we understand. And then immediately that this is sufficiently stabilized, he breaks it, not shattering, breaks it with a crack. And what you experience as a teenager is suddenly something opens within you and you look at someone else and you feel, oh, my life is meaningless without this falling in love or whatever form the experience is without the other. And in the general Western psychology, they speak of this as cathecting. Suddenly barriers fall and you lose your sense of separateness momentarily, but it's an unhealthy loss. There is not a healthy relationship. It's not really love. It's not the true sense of love. It's an imitation of the true love, which is we will discuss later perhaps as we grow in the discussion. But it is a first reflected, distorted element, and egoistic love, we may say. Ego is often used in a very negative sense, but we have to understand the true sense of the ego is only this sense of separation which allows us to form an individuality. It is a necessary and it is a healthy stage of development. Egoism is the obsessive reference to your own ego in a manner that is unhealthy. So ego is good as a base from which you can build something greater, but egoism is what gets us into difficulty and keeps us narrow and keeps us petty and unable to experience the reality which is infinite. But that reality being infinite, it always calls you. It's knocking on your doors all the time, but in a very graded, gradual way. Again, if we look at it from the larger picture of the reality, and we can now speak of these things freely because there's already been perhaps earlier backgrounds of this discussion, the whole universe is as if a conscious being, a conscious expression of the divine. And the whole infinity of possibilities of the divine are waiting to manifest in the universe and in us and through us. But that which is already in the universe is looking at you as this egg which has been growing and the chicken that's learning to break out of the egg. And at some point when the chicken is unable to come out fast enough, you get the little taps from outside, helping to crack your shell so that you may speed up the growth. But that is done with a wisdom, a profound wisdom, to ensure that the individuality, the base built, is never lost. So this initial description which I've made is common to all our life. There are further stages which are also common to our life. What happens then? Perhaps you lose the love of your life. You think your life is ended. You find a second lover, a third lover. Eventually, you get married to somebody because now it feels like your life is worthless without the others. And then out of that, of course, there are further complications and conflicts which break through to give birth to a child. At that point, you realize, holding the child, that you're ready to give everything you have for the well-being of this child. You want to give your best to this child. And of course, with all the good intention, you cannot. Just as with all the good intention where you thought your bond of love would be perfect and the only true love in the history of the universe, well, it doesn't work out. And we realize quickly that our sense of individuality is much more complex than we thought. I thought I wanted this, but I realized there are parts within me that don't want this or want something else. And I'm not an individual integrated person. I'm so many things pulling and pushing. And all my relationships are these complex pulls and pushes. And then as we grow further, we realize these different parts connect to different people and different spaces for different needs. And we are not complete unless we connect to all those spaces. Or rather, we don't feel ourselves fully expressed or fulfilled unless we have the full satisfaction of all these experiences. And bit by bit, nature draws out your potentialities and needs and connects you to more and more complex spaces until, let's say in late age, now you have grandchildren. You look at your own grandchildren and you look at other people's grandchildren, and they're almost the same. You would care for others' grandchildren as much as you would your own, interestingly. You wouldn't have done that to your own children because the sense of I, this is part of my body, this is a piece of me, is too strong. But in the grandchild, it's still my grandchild, but it's not a part of my body. So you are a little more detached and you can equally see all those grandchildren. Meanwhile, your own sense of I has widened enough that it's not just my family, but our families and our society and humanity, perhaps, if you're a little lucky. But that's about it. And then you'll be ready to quit your life. If you're not ready, you'll still be kicked out of your life. Eventually, when the biology ceases to sustain you, you'll come back and go through the same cycle again. Going through this cycle, let's say a few hundred times, you will find something changes that makes you more mature. Perhaps at a very early age, in teenage, you will have experiences where you will begin to respond as if you were a grandparent. And that's the slow process of nature by which across many lives, we are taught to outgrow our natural, limited starting point of the fragile ego, to grow into something wider, but on the base, which is still this ego. Now, If this were to go to its culmination, how far would it go? And very likely we cannot conceive of anything beyond this. In reality, though, there are experiences which creep in or burst in and surprise us. You're perhaps sitting on a mountaintop and suddenly, in this expanse of space around you, you forget yourself. You lose all sense of space or time and you're held in a vast, and then gradually the experience fades away. Or the impact of the experience stays and for a few days, and even after you come back from your mountain trip, something has changed. What happened? You have no explanation. And if you did not have a deeper spiritual perspective, you would say, oh, it's such a wonderful place. I feel so free when I'm in the mountains, but now I come back to city life and I forget my freedom. It stops there. In fact, something far more profound happened, which was also nature's intention, but which takes much longer in the normal scheme of things. As I said, the entire universe is this conscious being. And the infinity, which is the nature of this being, is always drawing us. But this process is too slow. And this is where the conscious participation in our spiritual journey comes in. And when you choose that, this experience is only the first of many through which we will grow rapidly to discover what. And here we will take a step back from this discussion and look at what are the different parts within us. I mentioned briefly that we're a crowd of so many different pulls and pushes. But what are they? Where are they? And Sri Aurobindo gives us a very detailed description of gradations of consciousness that form our physical body, our vital body, and our mental body. And within each of those gradations, there are faculties and powers and functions, and all these he maps out in great detail. You don't find such a great detail of mapping in any other text or spiritual tradition of the world in the history of the world. Now you can ask yourself why. Why does he spend so much time to go into all these details? And there's a very good reason. In most of the books or traditions, spiritual of the world, even when those traditions speak of fulfilling your life on earth, but the goal being spiritual, in most of these traditions, there is this implied sense that all this is useful, is a good base, but the spirituality is outside life. And in order to realize that, you have to eventually abandon all this. So make good use of this, but that's where it ends. Sri Aurobindo's Integral Yoga turns this around. The realization of the spiritual consciousness is only the first step. Its full manifestation and plenary revelation in life, as a divine life, as a transformed expression in matter, even in the physical body, of a divine mind and a divine life energy and a divinized body, this perspective changes everything. Now, every single faculty, every single power on every single plane of our consciousness is going to be divinized to express a unique aspect of the divine in the manifestation. And so each of these is important to be not only understood, but its true function known and the process by which it can be liberated to its own full divine potential. That needs to be mapped out. And if you're going to dwell upon each of these separately, well, one lifetime is not enough. But if you're going to drop the whole personality and come into the next, you can keep starting anew, you will get nowhere. So there has to be a faster way. There has to be a way in which we can realize our divine potential and as if flow it into all these powers and transform and liberate them. And this is possible in a single lifetime. And so the framework of the yoga that Sri Aurobindo articulates actually shows you the means to be able to realize this. There is no other such extraordinary, profound, and complete tradition, text, or experience ever described in human history. Sri Aurobindo represents not the culmination of the past. He represents a completely new beginning. And I use this is the phrase that the mother used to describe this, the place that Sri Aurobindo has in the spiritual history of this world. It is a complete new beginning, and what is revealed in this framework of the yoga and the means which have been given is also extraordinary and unprecedented. Well, I'm still not fully into the theme itself, but we have set a base in which now we will appreciate this theme of widening better. What is going to widen within you? If you look at many of the traditional yoga approaches, the widening is of your consciousness. You break out of your little ego, widen out. Let's say you identify the universe or with some transcendence beyond the universe, and that's it. You are free. What happens to all this? Well, it's there like a anchor dangling, which eventually will be dropped. But the moment you've accepted that the purpose of this whole manifestation is to manifest the divinity, and we are the focal point through which it has to manifest, each of these faculties and powers of each of these levels of consciousness within us is going to then open out to its own infinity. Because it is a power of the divine in essence, and it has to reveal the full infinite power that it represents. So now when we speak of widening, it is not merely your consciousness free of these narrow parts becoming wide, but eventually bringing the wideness into all these parts of your whole being. And what kind of an experience would that be? Well, it is right now inconceivable, and at best we can have a few glimpses of it. But those glimpses are so wonderful and so extraordinary that it makes it entirely worthwhile for us. I remember I was traveling in Hong Kong, and it was in the University of Hong Kong. The head of department of computers was sitting with me. We were discussing some of the projects he's doing. And he kept using a vocabulary and certain ideas which were too familiar for me. They resonated with certain spiritual things which you don't expect in a computer science department of a university. So I just asked him casually, well, are you part of any tradition? Do you follow any philosophy? He says, no. Do you follow any religion? He says, no. Then I couldn't contain myself. I said, well, where is all this coming from? You're using vocabulary which is so familiar. And then he was a little embarrassed. And then he confided his experience. He said at a certain age, I don't remember now, in his late teenage or so, 18 or 20, at a certain age, one day he just woke up from night sleep. He just woke up and everything had changed. And his experience was, he said, everywhere, everything in the universe was alive. And from everything, I felt this incredible, intense love flowing towards me. And from me, this intense love flowing towards every object, every human being, even the stone, every animal, everything, and to the whole universe. There was this outpouring and inflowing of love from everything in the universe. And he said, I couldn't function normally. So I'm listening with my eyes wide open, my ears wide open. What a beautiful experience he's describing. And then I said, and then he said, well, my friends took me to a psychiatrist. He put me on medication and the experience went away. And I said, what a pity, what a pity. Had you been in India, they would have celebrated you as a saint. But this little glimpse, and it's a first glimpse, it's actually a first entry into what is waiting for us to live in, not just as an experience, to be the reality in which we live. And far more that is still to pour out in this and through this experience. This is only a first glimpse. In your sight itself, you begin to perceive the divinity and the nature of the infinite in all finite objects when the inner sight opens, or in the inner hearing, or in the taste and smell and touch. In each of these contacts of the senses, you would experience the full widening of infinity. Infinity meeting you through a finite point of contact. Literally, the experience would be as you touch a flower, you will experience in the flower the entire universe leaning forward to become the flower. And the perfume of the flower would be the perfume of the entire universe, but through this form of flower, with a unique representation, with a unique quality highlighted. But in it, the whole universe. And such would be our experience in our senses. What happens then to our intelligence? The mind opens out. And what is the vehicle the mind is meant to represent or manifest? Knowledge. What does the mind open to? Therefore, all knowledge. You see, somewhere inside, deep within us, is this instinct that I should be able to know everything. Look at the scientist pursuing a track of or a quest for knowledge. Implied in the quest of the scientist is the idea or the conviction that he can know what he wants to know. When, for example, in Europe, there was a struggle with the church, and the church said, oh, all this cannot be explained, or this is how God does it, no explanation. Galileo's response when he was asked, what if God makes the planets go zigzag? Galileo's response was, then he would make our mind capable of understanding the zigzag movement of the planets. When Einstein was faced with some of the implications of quantum physics, he shook his head and said, I cannot accept that God will play dice with the universe. And I give these examples to show that implied, inherent to our seeking to know is this sense that I can know and the universe should be understandable. How do you know that? Why can it be beyond your understanding? And just think about what it would be like if the universe was beyond your understanding. You would watch helplessly this mystery, knowing you can never know it. And it conflicts with your deepest sense. If I cannot know it, I'm sure that I can rise to a level where I can know it. You know that. That is the deepest instinct or intuition of the mind. And therefore, the mind, when it awakens to the sense of the divine consciousness, opens out to become a vehicle for all knowledge, revealed divine knowledge, omniscience. And the nature of omniscience is not a hard drive. It's not a very big hard drive. It's not 1,000 GB or TB or data. It's fundamentally of a different grade of consciousness. There's a very beautiful movie, and if you have not seen it, I would highly recommend for you to see it. It's called Lucy. It describes a woman in whom the brain power is fully awakened to 100%. And she does something extraordinary because as the power opens out, she's going to die because the body cannot sustain it. So before she dies, she gathers all the material, all the knowledge of the universe, and completes the transmission of that knowledge to humanity by finally storing it on a hard drive and gives it to humanity as a gift. But the nature of omniscience is not reducible to a hard drive, because that is still a mental construct, and this is not the level at which you can understand the universe. The mind of God, which forms the universe, is embedded in the very substance of the universe. Or rather, the substantiality of the universe is the substantiality of the mind of God. And so in order to be able to know and understand the universe truly, you become one with that mind. And that mind does not know by reducing to logic, but by experiencing from within. And therefore, when the mind opens out to this true knowledge of omniscience, it must experience itself one with all things. Otherwise, it wouldn't truly know. And that knowledge cannot be reduced. What you are as an experience of yourself, for example, you could write 1,000 books, it would still be incomplete. Because there'll be nuances within nuances and complexities of nuances unendingly. We are finally a representation in finite form of an infinite potential. And so it is with everything in the universe. And the only way you can experience that and know it truly is to become one in the infinity that is within all things. So implied in this potential of the mind's divinization is a complete liberation out of its boundaries and opening out into some kind of an infinity. And the same would be true also of your life energies, of the prana which you carry and which you flow out in action in the world. Your prana itself would have to open out to its own infinity. Remember, we started with this idea that we are like a knot. Energy comes in from the universe, whirls in, and then flows out. But this knot now recognizes that its boundaries were artificial, and as the boundaries open out, it begins to experience the full flow of the universe entering, but also the full flow going out into the entire universe in its action. And so this life energy, when it opens out to its full infinity, will not only experience the pulls and pushes of the whole universe, every star out there moving would be sensed, but also your action would ripple out all the way to all the stars in the entire universe. However small, but it would be there. But if you look at the true nature of life energy, distance doesn't matter. And you could, in fact, initiate a ripple here, which would change the stars over there. Because that would be the nature of that. It would not be a reduction to our physical experience. It would be the true sense of the divine power, the divine energy working. The Buddha expressed this once by saying, when I move my finger, the stars move. Of course, the message he was conveying was more of the interdependence of the whole universe. But here what we are looking at is the action of omnipotence. When that consciousness opens out, there is a power of action which can impact the whole universe. And the body itself would have to participate in this infinity. While still made of a finite form, it would have to be able to perceive and sense the infinity and then act and engage with that infinity through every finite appearing gesture and act. Now, what would that feel like to somebody who sees it? When my teacher, MP Pandit, had his first darshan of Sri Aurobindo, he walked into the room and he writes, he said, he felt as if he was in the presence of the Himalayas. Such a massive, majestic, deep, intense power. As if the entire mountain range with its full potency held and yet in a single form. In Savitri, Sri Aurobindo describes all universe held in a wandering drop. I don't know if I have the exact quotation, but something like this. Such, even in the physical encasement being finite, the consciousness which it would express physically would be an expression of the infinite. And the power so great that its action here would be symbolic, representing an action of the whole universe and on the whole universe. Now, I'm giving these as indications because within each of the subplanes of the mind, vital and physical, and each of their powers and faculties, there would be the opening to infinity. Now, this is the sense of the wideness towards which nature is leading us. And now look back at what she does for this. Well, the small steps of you falling in love, getting married, getting entangled in complex social relationships, creating a complex web of interdependences, until one day you say, perhaps as a global businessman who's running a business that spans multinational spaces, my supply chain dependency spans the entire globe. So it's as if a tiny part of your mental vital strain of interests is spanning the earth, and it stops there. In itself, there is nothing in life which would force you to open out to those higher possibilities. And so what happens finally is not this nature, but higher nature, or the divine consciousness invades us, forces itself in to help us wake up. And as I gave the example of the friend in Hong Kong, it gave him a glimpse, but after that he did not pursue it. And the opportunity is as if lost. Perhaps later in life he will awaken to it and pursue it. But for those of us who seek this, remember, on the other side is the divine grace ready to help you and ready to give you the glimpses which will allow you then to grow further and opening out to these possibilities. Now, this is the broad frame I'm offering you. There is something else I have to describe before we move on to the full spiritual method of this awakening. There are today, and it is happening in a way which is not so healthy, but nevertheless we have to recognize its value. There are today tendencies all over the world for people to turn towards drugs. And in many traditions, they consider the experiences that they have under drugs to be spiritual experiences. And we must understand what they truly represent and what is the positive as well as negative aspects of these experiences. So first we recognize that on every plane of our consciousness is a potential opening to infinity, into universality. And so when you take drugs, which have a primarily plant-based origin, therefore primarily physical vital range of impact in us, they only open on their level of consciousness to the perception of universality. And it's not a living in the universality, it is a first opening to universality. That means it's as if your barriers are down and suddenly the light from out there is invading you. Just because you can see the sky does not mean you're one with the sky. What happens in the experience of the person who has been exposed through the drugs, the boundaries have suddenly been brought down, and he feels overwhelmed by what he sees. And the glimpse of something so vast is still by consciousness which is narrow. So they experience either exaggerated fear or exaggerated elation or all kinds of exaggerated emotional drama. The consciousness is never liberated. There are certain drugs in which they will find themselves, they will say, I feel as if I'm flying, or I feel as if I'm wide. But if you go into the character of the experience, yes, there is a glimpse of a wideness, but it is still an individual floating in the wideness as if flying. It is not a true liberation in which you would be one with the entirety of the wideness. And it is only taking place at the level of the physico-vital range, and as a result, influencing the mind. There are still other methods now being developed with technology where they trigger certain centers in the brain through transcranial stimulation, TCS. It's a technology which is still very mature, and it's more like shooting in the blind and provoking things and then having outrageously crazy experiences or even losing your balance. And there have been people who have been put on this thing called the God helmet. It's called the God helmet because it claims to offer you mystical experiences, where stimulation of certain senses, the people begin to see things. They have hallucinations, they see forms, experiences very similar to drugs. And sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But the positives are as valuable as the negatives because they are not a true spiritual awakening, they are still vital openings. The vital world, Sri Aurobindo explains, is a domain in which you have finer gradations of vital levels, each of which is infinity, and within each of those infinities there are ranges or domains. All the heavens and all the hells belong to the vital. So you can have extremely beautiful heavenly experiences and extremely ugly hellish experiences, and it's still in the domain of the vital. It's not even touched the universality of the mind. But these people, because they don't know anything better, will come back saying, oh, I had this spiritual experience. I went to the fourth heaven or seventh heaven or whatever classification they have from the religious background, with no way to validate whether it's true. And of course, it's true to a degree, but not true the way they think it is. So I'm pointing to these as being also gateways to open to a universal experience, but dangerous because the ego fragile, which I said is fragile, and nature has to work hard to make it strong, that ego can be disbalanced. Not only that, because the boundaries have been forced down outside your control. Things can invade from outside in a way that they can attack you or hook into you. And although later the boundaries you may think have come back because the drug wore off, no, there are holes. And the hooks have been set, and then you're always pulled. You're infected by force, by an energy which is outside your control, unable to free yourself from that entanglement. Or in that action, something is permanently damaged in the brain because all these drugs, they push the boundaries of the normal balance of working of the nervous system. Something is permanently damaged, and thereafter, for the rest of your life, you are vulnerable to certain types of influences. Again, without realizing it. And you may be damaged for life, preventing you from developing your higher spiritual potential, because every time you open to something higher, you are exposed equally to this dark or nasty world of the vital, from which you don't seem to have any way to protect yourself. Now, I'm explaining all this first to put in context the place of the drugs and those experiences, but also to warn you of how dangerous it is and understand why nature spent so much time of a few billion years to make our ego so rigid and strong that we cannot break those shells easily and expose ourselves indirectly to harm by a premature lower horizontal opening. And so the method of the yoga is not these. It is not premature stimulation of chakras or through drugs and opening on the horizontal scale in a premature way. The method of nature is to open horizontally, slowly through interactions and relationships, which is wonderful, but it doesn't take you far enough. The method of the spirit is to first rise above these domains, not opening to the vital, but opening to the mind, for example, or the higher parts of the mind first. And there you open out to something which is wider. Once that is sufficiently stable and realized, something of that wideness can begin then to penetrate top down and open out gradually but under your control. Because as your consciousness widens in these lower parts, as it widens, if you sense something which is uncomfortable, you can immediately choose to block it out or close that part until you're strong enough to be able to reopen if you need to and engage. It is entirely under your control at all times. Unlike drugs where it's done by an injection, you have no control until the drug wears off, you are vulnerable. And here, because it's a top-down process, you open to the higher ranges of consciousness where these things, dangers don't exist. And from there, in a top-down opening, gradually, the universalization begins. The body, being the most limited or dull in its receptivity, is of course the last to be fully universalized. But still, it can begin to share in glimpses of this by reflection from the higher to the lower. But this is not good enough. Because you have a big problem now when you open to such a kind of universality. The universality of the mental consciousness is completely different from universality of the vital consciousness. And the two collide. They don't see eye to eye. There is no correspondence between them. Just as even before universality, your well-developed intellect and your well-developed emotional intelligence are always in conflict. My heart says, this is what I should do. My mind says, oh, this is the most foolish thing you can do. And how do you integrate? You cannot. Because the principle on which they operate, the values they have fundamentally are different. You cannot harmonize them. The only way you can bring a harmony is if you find something which is common to both and to which both are willing to submit. Is there such a thing even? At least not in your experience, not in your nature, not in your personality. Inevitably, we end up with one dominating the other. Either the intellect will dominate the emotions and leave them unsatisfied, or the emotions will seize the intellect and use it to justify their desire. Either way, you don't have a real unification unless you step out of this. And that's where the importance of the interiorization of consciousness comes. Because, and this is again a unique principle that Sri Aurobindo brings in, which is not seen in any other tradition, and which is only generally alluded to in the Veda, in the description of the Agni. The common feature of all these levels is the principle of the divine will that supports. And that's the way the Veda sees it, and it sees it very universally. What Sri Aurobindo sees in this is an individualization of this will within us, which we will call the true soul or the psychic being, the inmost soul. And the character of this is, it is the essence of each plane. So if you take the vital consciousness and take it back to its essential, withdraw from the nature of form and rigidity of form to the pure essential quality, and similarly you do for the mind, to its pure essential consciousness, and these essential levels are all one continuum, as a backdrop supporting all these levels. But between themselves, across these levels, they are a continuum. And this is what Sri Aurobindo describes as the cyclic plane. It is not a hierarchical plane in the vertical ascension. It is an underlying supportive plane. The way the self supports all levels of consciousness. In a sense, the psychic plane is the self entering space-time as a backdrop, but inside space-time. And so it is equally experienced on all these planes, and it traverses all these equally as one consciousness. And the individualization of our soul as the psychic being is the one center, therefore, which has equal influence across all these gradations of our personality. And because it is the essence of them all these in the external form happily submit to their truth, to their essence. And so unless this poise of an interiorization leading to the awakening and the realization of the soul has been done, you cannot integrate these planes within you. And certainly not can you integrate their universalities. So we find here that in the true awakening of universality to its culmination, which requires harmonization, the interiorization becomes necessary. In fact, Sri Aurobindo warns about this in a very interesting way. He says, if there is a premature opening to the cosmic consciousness, there are three great dangers. The first danger is exaggeration of the ego. So suddenly you experience this consciousness, which is so wide. Let's say we take the experience of my friend from Hong Kong, and suddenly this incredible love that flows out. What happens next? Of course, it does not last too long because it's happening at a level which is not shared by the most superficial parts of you. So as you engage with activity, your reactivity is still there. Your natural instinctive moves of the surface personality are still there. You could still get angry while a deeper part in you feels this love. So because there's a disconnect. But as you experience this, you will say, I am so great. My love flows to everything. The whole universe loves me. And as if a part of your consciousness now seizes upon this widened perception and claims it as yours, and your little ego now just got exaggerated and expanded to the size of the universe. And this is the problem of a premature opening to the cosmic consciousness. There are two other dangers. One of these, he says, is also the danger of attack of energies or forces which are inimical to your growth. When you open your barriers, well, they have entry into you just as much as you have influence over them. And you may not be ready to be able to deal with those energies because they don't like the fact that you are progressing too fast, and they need to throw in a few spanners in your journey. And there's the third danger, which is of the illusoriness of the world. When the consciousness opens out, again, these are variations in experience, when it opens out to the perception of the underlying presence of the divine or the self, against the solidity, the permanence, the sheer reality and concreteness of that experience, things in the world appear to be almost unreal. Like the whole world is made up of like a stage set, like a cinema fake set. Everything is made of cardboard and made to appear like a pretense, hollow, unreal, no substantiality. It's fickle. If you poke your finger, it would just collapse. Or so it appears. Compared to the depth and intensity and permanence, solidity, sheer reality of that underlying experience. And so what's the correction to these three possible dangers of a premature opening? And what makes it premature? So the correction, he says, is the psychic consciousness being sufficiently emerged and taking charge of the personality. That would be the preparation before you could have this opening to cosmic consciousness safely. Or opening to the self within, behind, through the psychic. So this is another problem. You could open in some of the more Vedantic traditional paths. You would step back from the whole personality and open to the self. But then again, this illusoriness would come. But if you were aware of the psychic and experienced the self as the backdrop of the psychic, the source of the psychic itself, then you know yourself in this universe as the psychic being, and the universe is experienced as real as the self, although still illusory in appearance of the underlying reality. And then one could begin to perceive the underlying reality cut through the appearance of the illusoriness. So this is to show you that the full awakening of this widening of consciousness would not be safe nor complete unless this inward centering and foundation in the psychic influence, at least, would be sufficiently set. And a similar thing we will see in relation to the upward ascent as we proceed. Now, what happens next? Let's say we discover this influence in the center which can harmonize our mind and vital, but still, as we open out to the universality, in the universality of the mind, you will still see incompatibility with the universality of the vital, because you still need to find something on the universal scale, not just your individual consciousness, which is common to both. And what is common? They're so different fundamentally. And the physical world equally is so different. And within them, sometimes finer gradations, which are so different, an infinity of those gradations. How do you ever harmonize all these? At best, you can slide between them and make some kind of a compromise. That's about it. Unless you were to go to the very substance which forms all these worlds. And that essential substance, which is also universal, became the base from which you could then experience all these densities of worlds to be specialized densities or concentrations of that. And therefore comes the need for a vertical ascension to be able to harmonize the horizontal. And the higher you go, the more complete the embracement of the lower ranges can be. Of course, the higher ranges of mind, for example, are much more easy to harmonize because they're plastic, they're open, they're already conscious. The same consciousness going towards the physical would experience a huge resistance and darkening and an inability to integrate unless you went all the way to the highest, which alone can overcome the lowest. And this is one of the very special features of the ultimate goals of the integral yoga, which includes physical transformation. Your physical consciousness should be awakened to the divine and must participate and share in the delight of the divine consciousness, but also must transform its working in terms of the divine will freely expressed instead of its old habitual, let's say, inconscient habit by which it is currently formed. That would be the physical transformation. That requires the highest power, what he has called the highest supramental, being able to deal with it. But anything else before that can be attained to by higher ranges which have not reached the highest of the supramental. So the higher you go, the more you are able to embrace the lower and include into yourself. And therefore, the need for the vertical ascension is seen for the fulfillment of the full horizontal potential. Here we have an important observation Sri Aurobindo makes. In the traditional systems of yoga, which aim at a withdrawal from life, or which aim at a realization of the absolute, even if they don't withdraw from life, as in Buddhism, the goal is realization of the absolute, transcending the relativities. Just that as a goal, and you can still see the world as a domain of suffering, out of which eventually you will withdraw. But meanwhile, you accept that it is there. But you will live in a consciousness that is free. Even if that be the goal, he says, the error of such a one-pointed ascent, whether through illusion or through suffering of the outer reality, the one-pointed ascent makes one great error. It concentrates on the center and forgets the perimeter. And the error of these experiences is that they know the divine only in its transcendence beyond space, time, and form, but do not know the divine that flows into and embraces space, time, and form. The embrace of the universe, the divine as universe, the horizontal expanse is ignored. And because you chose the divine as only that and not this, well, you are satisfied that you attained to the divine that you had conceived of, but you have not attained to the divine's concept of himself, which includes the universe equally. So he says the correction for these, although we understand the importance of this vertical ascension with initially an exclusive focus perhaps, but it is not complete unless it turns around to re-embrace the world in its full horizontal expansion. The expansion by which the divine becomes the universe on all these planes must then be yours if you are to embrace this manifestation. So now we come to an interesting idea. There is a vertical ascension required, but there is also horizontal expansion taking place for each of these vertical ascensions. And in each vertical ascension, there is a re-embracement of the universe as it. In a sense, this is what nature was doing through the very slow process of evolution. Each time she woke to a new possibility, a new level of consciousness, she turned back on the lower ranges and embraced them and brought them up, recast them in terms of this new consciousness. So when life became manifest, it turned upon matter and drew upon matter and made it living matter as plants or the tissue of our body, or mind taking up this living matter and made the tissue conscious, self-aware, and then expanded the influence of the mind to change nature even and make nature more organized and so on. But it's not transforming, liberating from that higher consciousness. It just changes a little bit and it stops there. It is unable to go beyond. But when we enter still higher ranges of consciousness, the power they bring down is far greater, and they can take up and fundamentally transform this working, but also experience the fullness of the universality on each of these levels. And from the highest, We experience all these levels as aspects of the same one universal. Here's the key, therefore. You could go through the slow process of nature. You could work on each of these powers, faculties within you very slowly across millions of years, or you can make a rapid ascent, never in isolation though, knowing always that it is the focal point of this whole expanse. You make a rapid ascent to as high as you can, and centered and founded in the reality of the divine consciousness, you turn to embrace the whole world, and of course it includes yourself. And in this embracement, all these faculties, all these powers now can freely open out on every plane of consciousness to their full universality, to their full completeness, to their full infinite potential that they contain and which they're struggling to reveal. From that single point, turning back to re-embrace. So such is the broad framework, and I'm conscious that I'm simplifying things a lot, but this is how we can first get an understanding of these different directions or dimensions of our awakening. There is an inward awakening necessary even as we grow wider. Otherwise, we cannot really be truly integrated as a person. There's an upward opening necessary and a heightening. Otherwise, we cannot truly integrate the planes in their width. And in the highest divine consciousness, we experience that which is the fulfillment of all these lower planes. And that coming down is the only means by which they can all be awakened and transformed. So this is a very broad perspective of the nature of our human journey that we begin with every little birth, but which we do not have enough time or means in the normal human life to be ever able to complete. And this is where nature can take us up to a certain point and not more. And then she says, that's all I can do, help me. And from above then the divine help comes, takes up what has been prepared by nature and begins now to reshape and recast it. Sri Aurobindo uses an extraordinary phrase, extremely suggestive and extremely powerful in its implications. In the Life Divine, he says that one of the conditions for you to be able to have continuity of consciousness across lives is for you to become plastic to the influence of the infinite, to the touch of the infinite. That means when this divine consciousness comes to act on you, to help you, are you able to respond to it sufficiently? Are you plastic enough to it? Or are you still this rigid rock? So it has now to knock to soften you and maybe crack you a little bit in order to soften you. Or are you already ready in your natural evolution, coming to a point where you willingly give yourself to the touch of the infinite and say, shape me, form me. If this is the base that we have been brought to, then thereafter the divine Shakti, the divine energy, the power of the divine consciousness working on us and in us is able to shape us and rapidly develop this potential and awaken us, lead us to our highest divine fulfillment. This is where that principle of surrender becomes so important, to be able to give yourself to her. But you cannot do the surrender without first a call and then a removal from within you of the things which oppose or resist that which you aspire for. So the 3 steps: aspiration, which is where you call and you say, beyond this, I need the help. Rejection, which is the part that says the things which are not aligned to my call, well, that I have to be able to remove. And then the surrender, which is when the action of the divine Shakti begins on you, you yield, you give yourself and joyously give. And you see, these 3 words which Aurobindo uses is encapsulated the essential process of the transformation. But this must take place in all of our being, in all of our parts, in all their faculties and processes. But you begin with that which is most conscious and most aspiring. And often it's a part of our higher mind or higher life emotional part, which loves the divine mother, gives yourself to the divine mother and says, here I am, I'm your child. I belong to you. My life is given to you. And it's a small part. The physical body may feel the joy of that for a while, but it says, yeah, but I need to go to sleep now. Enough of this. Well, you still accept that. You go to sleep and then you wake up, and bit by bit you bring into the body the participation into this and in all the parts of your nature, To the extent you're able to do that, to that extent she is able to work within you and make that change. So the nature of the process of transformation in the integral yoga is also such that not on your strength and pace, which is too little, but on the pace of the divine Shakti, which is infinite, and the strength, which is infinite, that the transformation is actually done and the consciousness liberated to its full potential. So this is the broad framework which I want to share. You will understand the importance of the inward, the upward, as well as the outward or widening of consciousness and liberation of consciousness, and the principal process not only of this liberation but also the transformation of your nature. And in this you find a kind of encapsulation of the whole perspective of the integral yoga, and even the fulfillment in the full divinization of our life into its infinite potential. I'll pause with this big picture and invite your questions.
Thank you, Sraddhalu. It was quite a vision of the whole integral yoga in all the details. Beautiful overview. Of course, there is another kind of way of describing it, from the psychic transformation towards spiritual, and finally to supramental, the way how Sri Aurobindo deals with this. And the psychic is enlarged, our psychic is universalized. But first it has to come to the front. That means it already made mind, vital, and body its means, or some kind of transformed them to be enlarged, to be universalized. So that's just, exactly kind of the summary of all your description of how things should take place, and why the psychic transformation is to be first, not to fall into those dangers of being influenced by a universal consciousness within our not formed yet and not conscious ego sense in the mind, vital, and body. Yes. Thank you for this beautiful overview. There are many questions here, and I'm not sure how we should proceed, whether you should read them and select what you want, or I should help you out.
What I could do is perhaps merge some of them.
Yeah.
I suppose everybody cannot see the questions. Is that correct?
No, they can't see.
So there's one question about what happens when we study something we cannot understand, and then we come back after a week or fortnight and then we can understand. There's another question about what happens when we leave the body. Can we choose the time when we leave? And someone asks about the shell of the chick is cracked with infinite wisdom so that individuality is not lost. What is meant by that? And what specific exercises are most beneficial and supporting for widening consciousness? Difference between prana and consciousness, how do we distinguish? So these are the first few. I'll just touch upon all these and perhaps blend some of them into each other. So first, recognize that from the perspective of the true soul, the psychic being, you have always utter freedom. But the power to exercise the freedom may not be fully developed, because it has still to exercise this freedom through the mind, through the vital, through the physical body, which may not be receptive to it. The psychic being may want something, but the person's surface personality and this narrow ego sense will say, I desire this, and it may go in a completely different direction from the psychic. So there's always a struggle, or let's say disconnect between the true seeking and the freedom of choice which is there, from the more superficial mechanical parts of our nature, where that freedom does not really exist. We are almost victim of our own nature and character and habits and circumstances. So when it comes to the sense of choice when you leave the body, the psychic being has a choice. It can choose to stay on. But if the outer personality shell is damaged, or chooses to allow itself to be damaged, the psychic being says, yeah, but what's the point of continuing when I can't do what I want? And while we say it has a choice to stay, it may choose to leave because there's no point in staying. Equally, if the outer body is completely damaged, still the psychic may say, no, I'm going to wait until such a day. And we have seen examples of this even in the ashram. And one person comes to mind. I can share this. Hutaben, her body had already gone to a point where medically she could not be alive. And I've seen the results of her blood test. She did not have enough the necessary sodium and potassium levels to be conscious. And yet she was conscious, and you could see she was struggling to hold. And she said, I will go to the nursing home, and you will, when I come back, you will put me in this, etc. She described what had to be done. And the day before she left, and she chose to leave on the same day as the mother, she told everybody, tomorrow you'll be taking me home and you'll dress me in white. She chose her day. She literally dragged her body. You could see that. That's the extent of an awakened psychic being. It can just drag the material. It can hold it in sustenance as it chooses. Or on the other hand, if there's a gap between the two, the outer personality is blocked. The psychic says, no point. I'm going to start afresh. Or it will ask for help. And the divine help comes and gives it a knock and a crack. You see, the outer personality shell is too rigid. And it needs a blow from outside. Suddenly, all this arrogance of my achievement is lost overnight. And I'm broken as a person. And I start introspecting. And a whole different journey begins. Or a kind of a shock that comes and you question, why am I doing all this? What am I seeking? When the 9/11 attack took place, many people who were working in the building, who came late and so didn't die, they held this shock. They said, what have I been doing all these years? And they chose completely to change the direction of their life. It was an opportunity. The shock, the crack was an opportunity for the inner influence to push forward and seize on that moment to put its influence. And so the crack of the infinite wisdom from outside is there to assist, and often in response to the call of the true soul, which may feel trapped. It is also the basis to understand how we understand things which we couldn't understand. So you read something, your mind is not sufficiently capable of fully appreciating. But the inner person who is you, the true person inside, the true knower, it turns and says, yes, this is good. And from inside out, it puts out in it its influence of true knowledge that fills your mind from inside out. And you come back to the same text after a week and say, wow, this makes so much sense. What happened in between was the attempt to understand called for help from the true knower within you, who already has the knowledge. And that true knower put out its true knowledge. But you were too busy turned outward. So the true knowledge could not pop up immediately. It popped up later when you went to sleep. Or over the next few days when you were busy with other things, it got a chance to put out its influence. So all of these, I've answered 3 of the questions now. All of these point to one great truth, that your real potential is within you. And so the first exercise, beneficial supporting exercise for awakening and eventually widening, is turn your gaze inward. Now, when you first turn, you'll become conscious of so many things inside you, and there's a lot of junk. I've known of people who spent hours introspecting and brooding over their thoughts and emotions, which is an utter waste of time. They're all clutter. Instead, turn that attention to your deepest center, to your deepest aspiration. Or there are many ways you can connect or focus upon it. Become conscious of the part within you that loves the Divine Mother. That's through the heart center. Become conscious of the part within in your mind that wants to know and feel and serve the divine. Loves the truth, loves the perception of the divine, loves the sense of the permanence of the divine, or the knowledge that the divine represents. So become conscious of that deepest part of you that is in relation already with the divine, in whatever way that you know the divine. That's your focus. Put your attention on that. Deepen your concentration upon that. Invite its influence and its values to fill you more and more. Refer your decisions to that center or that influence. So that bit by bit, everything you do in life is aligned to and centered around whatever deepest center that you're able to access. By the process of deepening of this concentration, you will actually discover still deeper the true source of it, which goes all the way finally to the true psychic being within you. So this would be a very simple exercise that you could take up as a first base. And when the consciousness is more deeply known, more deeply felt, with it, you perceive the depth in other things. So the insight is this: whatever you know within you is what you can know in others. or in things outside you. When you become conscious of the deeper ranges within, you perceive those deeper ranges in other people and other things. And automatically your perception of the universe is felt differently. You feel them intimately yours. Because what you feel in them resonates with what is within you, and you feel them as if somewhere as a part of you. And that resonance becomes your first opening to the true sense of universality, which is not transactional, but in identity. So unless you develop within you the capacity, the power of the deeper identification, you will not be able to experience this. Second exercise would be to open all that you are and your littleness to that which is above you, where your higher ranges are held, which are naturally infinite. And when you open yourself to these and invite their influence to fill you, you'll actually experience as if something descending, a sense of a wideness descending, or a sense of a peace descending, or just the divine presence descending. And in the perception of this presence, you will feel the sense of the infinite, and then you'll be able to perceive that again in all things around you. A third exercise, which again suggests itself from this insight, make a conscious effort to dwell on this idea that inside everything, the energy which forms the atoms is the divine energy. Inside every energy flow of those atoms and molecules and forms and even flowers and things is the divine consciousness working to build these and playing in them, enjoying itself in them. And you begin now to dwell through the mind and through the sight and through your senses upon the pervasiveness of the divine, the immanence of the divine, as the divine mother or the divine presence in an abstract way, whatever is easier for you. And after a while, you'll find the perception of this begins to become more and more vivid. So these are three broad exercises which would be a help. All of these would lead eventually to a widening, deepening, and a rising of consciousness. In this, you will experience the different grades. Prana is a very distinctive grade of energy and force of energy. The consciousness is a general term which we use to describe that which is common in all these, where you can become aware. You're aware in prana, that is the consciousness in the prana, but the energy of prana is the force and impulsiveness with which prana flows. The consciousness of the mind is where you're aware, but the movement of the mind is the turn to know and to act and will. But the consciousness is the underlying awareness which holds and spans across all this. So I think I've covered all these first few questions. Next, someone is asking, when rising and widening in consciousness, there's a point where I feel the mind is stepping in the way to go further in the full expansion. How do we drop the vehicle of mind, and what is the part that holds back? So in this rising movement, which also one can consciously participate and develop simply by turning your awareness up like this. Become conscious of the mother as the vast presiding presence who presides over the whole universe. And you open yourself like a child opening to its mother, like a flower opening to its sun. And when you give yourself, that's when you experience the closeness. And her action begins to work in you. It's a very simple process. And at that point, you may feel something is holding you back. There are two ways. One is you can drop that thing and try to ascend to something higher, which is also useful. But much more useful in the long run would be the part where you feel this resistance. You open that to her. The fact that you can feel resistance means that you're aware of it. And if you're aware of it, you're aware in it, you can open it from inside to say, take me in your embrace. Let me lose my limits, dissolve myself into your awareness. So it's as if you enter that limited part and say, here, I let go. Open me out to you. I give an analogy. If you take a bowl and approach the ocean and try to grab the ocean with your bowl, you will say, yes, I've got the whole ocean water in my bowl. Yes, it's the ocean water, but you got a piece of it. The only way your little bowl can hold the ocean is if it bursts. But then the point is lost. So what you do, you let the bowl enter and widen out, give itself to the ocean. Let the ocean seize the bowl and open its boundaries. And that's the way your mind or any part of you that you feel resistant will naturally open. And because she leads the whole process, trust that the Divine Mother working in you will open bit by bit, gradually, so that there is no imbalance and you're taken at each step in a very secure way. This is the reason why in the integral yoga, there's no focus on opening of chakras. You'll see in Sri Aurobindo's letters on yoga or on his writings, barely, incidentally, he'll mention the tantric system of chakras, or in the Hatha Yoga, the importance given to chakras and the Kundalini. That's it. He never says, open your Kundalini, open your chakra, do this. None of that. Why? There's a big difference in the approach of yoga. In those approaches, the goal is to get out of this personality and merge yourself into some transcendence. So any chakra is a hole or gateway to get out, or activated to liberate your consciousness, to open out to something, but with the aim of discarding this. So you can have an opened chakra, you can open to cosmic consciousness and be the same crabby, irritable, angry person. We have stories of rishis who would give curses on the drop. With the power of the higher realization, backing the curse, what's the point? So in the integral yoga, the goal is not opening chakra, the goal is purifying and opening the entire plane of consciousness, of which chakra is a focal point. So when the entire plane is awakened and into that the mother works, the chakra naturally also will follow, but not prematurely, only to the extent that the purification and opening has taken place. So chakra opening is incidental and it's done so gradually that you never have any shocking and unbalanced experiences. So this is just to explain that the approach here is different. And so do not confuse with those methods. There are a few questions here. There are people who say they channel angels or higher beings. And then the role of the mother in this process, how do you surrender to her? Is the divine mother the same as the mother? And then there's a question which is about psychotic experiences in Western psychology, having premature experiences of cosmic consciousness, premature expansion when the ego is not prepared. How do you work with such an individual? Treatment for schizophrenics, etc. Okay, so I'll again combine all these into a single general answer. Unfortunately, a lot of what you read in Western psychology is coming from a very immature understanding of reality. So anything which is non-material, they tend to use the word spirit or spiritual. In fact, even in a language such as French, there is no word to distinguish spiritual from mental. The word esprit is mind as well as spirit in one go. Because anything non-material is spirit. That's it, by definition. And unfortunately, this division is shot through in the whole Western psychological approach, where initially they started with the idea that all mind processes are products of brain processes. And later, even as they come to a recognition that, yes, there are different levels of consciousness, perhaps, but the old idea that it's all one big spiritual domain is still somehow mixed in. And so what happens is a lot of very crude, low-level experiences are described or presented as spiritual. Channeling by angels or any being, they're all the same in terms of consciousness. They are all links to the vital world. Any being from the vital world could say, I'm here to give you knowledge and lead you away. And you could choose to accept it and say, oh yes, who are you? And the being will say, I'm such and such angel. I'm representative of God. Or if he thinks that you are an admirer of some historical figure, he will say, I am so and so, the head of your religion. And you cannot know the difference. Imagine on the internet, you are on a chat box. On the other side, somebody comes and says, I am so and so. Will you believe it? You'll say, show me proof. The person will send you a birth certificate. Will you believe it? You say, yes, this could be faked. How will you know unless you meet directly with the person and assess their competence by other means? But the problem with these beings is they can be anything and you will never know. And they have the benefit that they can read your mind. So when you try to assess them, they know what answer you expect and they feed you back what you expect. They can even tell you things which you don't know because they have access from the vital plane to all kinds of information of the world. And so they will tell you, oh, there's a problem which is going to happen tomorrow. They will tell you your grandmother's name. They'll tell you where a particular treasure is hidden in your mother's cupboard, and you'll all validate and say, oh, therefore you must be God. No, you are just a vital being. And there's a reason why. I can give you this assurance, anybody who communicates with you like this is a vital being and not a divine being. Very simple logic. Because if a divine being came, it could be impersonated by a lower vital being and you would not know the difference. And therefore the divine being will say, I will not allow my communication channel to be hijacked. For this reason, the mother said, she will never channel through people. She will never do automatic writing. She will never communicate through these, people talking through voices and mediums, because there is no way to identify. Anybody can impersonate. She said the only channel which nobody can impersonate or hijack is the contact you have through your deepest center in the psychic being, which feels itself a part of the mother. And therefore it spontaneously feels what is the mother's will and her guidance in itself, bypassing all channels which could be hijacked. So the only way she will communicate is through that center. And she gave that assurance right from the beginning, just because she said, they will imitate my voice, they will imitate my handwriting, because that's easy to do from the vital planes. So what I'm pointing out is all these people who channel, whoever they may claim to channel, is not a spiritual being and represents at best some higher vital being or mental being at best. And they also don't find it too interesting to bother with humans. Generally, the higher vital beings do this and do not trust it. At best, you can look at some of that literature and say, yes, it's interesting how much information can come, but the reliability of the information is always questionable. Do not trust. So psychotic experiences unfortunately come into this category, where people have done these practice these things of opening the chakras or done something, or they have an imbalance in their nature, in their nervous system, which has opened them to experiences through drugs. The bulk of their experiences, they may call it cosmic consciousness, is not cosmic. The cosmic consciousness in its true sense, the way Sri Aurobindo articulates it, is the consciousness which opens out to the totality of the Brahman. It is the consciousness of Satchidananda as it embraces the universe. That's what we call cosmic consciousness. It is the one consciousness in which all these planes are seen as aspects of itself. To live in that is the most fulfilling experience. It is liberating and fulfilling experience. What these people describe as cosmic is only an opening to universality at a lower vital level. That's about it. And any universality in their experience, they will use the word cosmic loosely. So be careful when people use certain words. For example, the healers who will say, I'm doing spiritual healing, cosmic energy healing. No, it has nothing to do with cosmic or spirituality. It is a healing done by pumping life energy, which can be universal. And it's wonderful. But the wording is only, I will say, marketing vocabulary and is not correct. Do not believe just because someone uses a high word. They will say supramental energy channeling. No, it's not. It is just a vital energy coming in, and you should be very practical about these things. The supramental consciousness is consciousness fundamentally of infinity. Unless you are able to live in the infinite, you will never be able to experience the supramental consciousness directly. At best, you will get partial projections of it, which in the Veda are described as the rays of the sun, the intuitive flashes or things from some of the higher intermediate planes, but that's about it. Unless you live in infinity, you cannot even experience directly the supramental, much less direct it. And so when we enter in relation with the Divine Mother, we are a finite who begins to build a relationship with she who is infinite. That Divine Mother is the creative Shakti, Adi Shakti, the original energy, the creative power which forms the universe. She is utterly conscious of you and is within you as the energy that forms even your mind, life, and body. She is in you, and she awakens in you your intelligence and your strength and your heart's love. She also, where necessary, can embody herself in human form for the purpose of a particular action on earth and to help humanity to make a breakthrough in evolution. And such a manifestation we call an avatar. The avatar is a physical embodiment of that divine Shakti who's creator of the universe. But you, because you're human and see through human eyes, will see, oh, this body form. So I give the example of the experience of seeing Sri Aurobindo and experiencing the power of the Himalayas, of that massive infinite presence. And yes, if you are conscious, you will feel that. If you're not conscious, if you're not awake in your inner parts, you will say, oh, nice, sweet woman. We've had people who met the mother and came back saying, oh, she was a nice, sweet woman. That's it. Nothing else touched them. And there were those who had life-changing, universal experiences. One person I had met in the US, and when he heard I was coming from the ashram, he took pains to come and meet me. And he said, the first time he went to the mother, he had come to Auroville for some work, and they said, you must go and see her. He said, okay, old woman, I'll give my respect. He went and met, and he doesn't know what happened. He stood before her, and then spontaneously he knelt before her and experienced this tremendous power of love flowing into him. And then suddenly he had tears in his eyes narrating this. He said, I don't know what happened. I felt layers and layers opening up within me, and I found myself bounced around all over the universe. And all the time there was this tremendous love pouring and pouring in the whole universe as I was bounced around. He comes back from that experience, tears streaming, and he said, for 3 days I didn't know what was happening. I don't know how I ate food, how I walked. I don't know what I did. For 3 days I was in that experience, and then it subsided. And then what happens next? He just come to help in Auroville, and he sends word to the mother. My teacher, MP Pandit, was the secretary to the mother, so he took the message. The man said, Mother, I don't know what to do with my life now. You see, it was not a premature experience. Mother gave it to him because he was ready for it. They said, I don't know what to do with my life. I can't join the ashram or Auroville. I'm not ready for that. But I can't live my normal life anymore. Interestingly, you'll be surprised, Mother sent a letter addressed to the Dalai Lama, introducing this man to him, sent the letter to him and saying, go and help the Dalai Lama. Now you'd wonder why. Why didn't she say, go and help in Auroville? She saw the soul's purpose and the mission it had come to do, and she directed him for that purpose. And this man played a significant role in the emergence of the Dalai Lama as a global figure and so on. But this is to tell you that this embodied form that we know as the mother, that we name as the mother, whatever her birth name might be, is that Shakti, embodied. According to our capacity, we may see her in this form only, or we may see this form as the gateway to her universality and her cosmicity and her transcendence as the Divine Mother. And all of these are simultaneously aligned in this center for the duration of that physical body's physical existence. And that's it. So the mother said, this body has no value. You'll be surprised when she said that. It has only as much value as humanity chooses to give to it. Because for her, she is living in that consciousness. The body is only a focal point. If you choose to give that body the necessary value, then yes, through that body, she can give you a certain help. If you don't focus on that body, she can give you the same help directly also. It does not matter. So to this question about, is this the Divine Mother, I will simply say that depends on you. If you choose to see in this form the Divine Mother, if your soul recognizes, oh, this is the Mother, and gives itself, yes, the form is your focus, but the form is only an entry point to she, who is the Divine Shakti. And at some point you can close your eyes and go through the form into the infinite love that she embodies, that she manifests. And that's really the gateway of the sadhana. So I think maybe we can, it's up to you now. To Vladimir, do you want to take it forward? Shall we take other questions, or should we close now?
Yeah, thank you, Sraddhalu. I think we are just half an hour over our time.
And I think it's a good point to pause upon. Right. Dwelling and meditating on the sense of the Divine Mother, who she is to us. And I will put it this way, whether you recognize her in this particular form of the Mother or not, know the Divine Mother, put yourself in her hands, and to the extent that you're able to put yourself in her hands, she will be able to act upon you for the transformation. I'm going to refer to a letter of Sri Aurobindo where a disciple asks him, so and so has told me that if I surrender myself entirely to the mother, then she can transform me in an instant. Is it true? Think about what Sri Aurobindo might say. His answer is, yes, it is true. If you put yourself entirely in her hands, if you surrender yourself entirely, then she can transform you entirely in an instant. Think about the implications. The problem, though, is we cannot surrender ourselves entirely because we're not even conscious of ourselves entirely. We can only surrender the part we are conscious, and even that too with difficulty. So the key is going to be your relationship with the Divine Mother in whatever way you conceive of her, whatever form, gateway you may use. And perhaps you come from a different tradition where you know the Divine Mother in a different name or through another form or another name, doesn't matter. Put yourself as the Divine Mother, not some intermediate power, as the Divine Shakti who is above all. Even if it was an intermediate power through which you knew, don't stop with the power, go to that which is the source of all powers, all Shakti, and open to her. In the part in which you're conscious and which is ready to give itself, and it may be a tiny part, doesn't matter. But in that part that you open, she will fill herself, and through that part increase the consciousness in the rest of you, which then bit by bit will turn and learn to open, through which more will open, and so on. So there'll be a continuous interchange of your consciousness with hers, through which this yoga will be done primarily by her, but with your participation and support, not against your will, with your conscious, willing, joyous self-giving and participation. And so the nature of the sadhana is also, Sri Aurobindo says, the sunlit path, because it is not a painful process. It is not a struggle. It is not a battle. It is not a suppression and destruction of your instincts. It is the turning of your instincts, turning of your consciousness to her in joy. And so each step of the journey is joy to greater joy, and not struggle, not suffering. Spiritual life is not meant to be suffering. Suffering is not sadhana, it is perversion of sadhana. The nature of the integral yoga is a journey from joy to greater joy, from consciousness to greater consciousness, and from closeness and intimacy to greater intimacy, and deepening in the intimacy, depth, wideness, and height of the Divine Mother's consciousness. That's all. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you, Sraddhalu.